Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're stepping into the digital public square. This world made of algorithms and pixels where, well, how we present ourselves, our identity, it's constantly being built and scrutinized. It's on a scale nobody could have imagined before. And our sources for this deep dive, they really zero in on this one major collision. It's between, on one hand, this very modern drive to create a perfect, curated self online, and on the other hand, this really ancient spiritual challenge, this stumbling block, performance piety. So our mission today is to analyze how the very design of social media platforms is subtly changing what it means to practice your faith, to express it, to witness to it. Yeah, the tension is just, it's right there, isn't it? We're living in this culture that's so obsessed,
Yeah.
totally focused on measurable approval. But at the same time, we've got this 2,000-year-old warning ringing in our ears from the Sermon on the Mount. The warning against doing righteous things just to be seen by others. It feels like a head-on conflict, the platform versus the principle.
And it's not an accident, that conflict. I mean, the core idea here, the thesis from our sources, is that these platforms, they aren't neutral spaces at all. They're actually formative. They shape us, their design, how they grab our attention, give us those instant rewards like likes and hearts, how they prioritize what looks good. It makes them structurally perfect breeding grounds for performative religion. That measurable feedback, the likes, the shares, it's this powerful incentive. And it starts to redefine what successful spiritual expression even looks like, often in these very transactional terms.
That makes total sense. The system itself rewards the performer. Okay, so if we're going to understand the spiritual performance, we really need to get a handle on the performer first. Let's start there with the basics. The architecture of the curated self, right? The curated self. It's a term we hear a lot, but maybe we assume everyone knows exactly what it means. Our sources actually give a pretty tight definition. What are the sort of key elements?
Well, they define it very precisely. It's the selection, organization, and presentation of online content about yourself. And the key thing to grasp is this isn't you, not the whole you anyway. It's really a carefully constructed and presented version that you choose to show the world online. Think of it like a personal highlight reel, the best moments, the prettiest pictures, often without the messy context of real life.
So the user isn't just passively sharing, they're actively constructing this digital version of themselves, like an architect.
Exactly, yeah. The individual becomes the architect, the designer, maybe even the artist of their own digital embodiment of self. And crucially, this digital self, it's usually not the truly authentic self. It tends to be an idealized self. It's the person you kind of wish you were, or maybe the person you want other people to think you are. A lot of effort goes into managing that gap between, who you really are and what you project.
And the sources connect this way of building an identity online to a much bigger picture, calling it a neoliberal trend. Can you unpack that a bit? Why has identity become something like a commodity? How does that play into the curated self?
Yeah, that's really fundamental. So this neoliberal idea, it emphasizes individualism, competition, seeing everything, even parts of yourself, as a kind of market. And in that environment, the self gets transformed into what the sources call a commodified self. You manage it, you market it, you distribute it like a personal brand. And the goal, sometimes explicitly, is to boost its social value, maybe even its actual market value. Whether you're literally selling something or just selling an image of success, your identity becomes this kind of capital you have to constantly work on.
Okay, so right away there's this built-in tension. We all say we want authenticity, right?
Mhm.
We want to be real. But the very act of curating seems to involve performance.
The tension is inherent, absolutely. The sources argue that just the act of selecting content, choosing what to show an audience, introduces this dramaturgical element. It's strategic, it's a performance, even if you don't consciously mean to deceive. The second you start thinking, what will people like, or how will this look? You've already shifted from just expressing yourself to, presenting yourself strategically. And this strategy, it helps break down the walls between public and private life. Really personal things, a quiet prayer, a family moment, even just feeling reflective, get documented, maybe made to look good, aestheticized, and then shared for others to consume. It changes what intimacy means, turning it into something shareable, something valuable in the attention economy.
And the psychological burden of keeping up that separation, the real you versus the ideal you. That's where the link to piety starts getting clearer, isn't it? If you're always performing, you must be constantly worried about the real self getting, found out.
That anxiety is absolutely the engine here. The curated identity acts like a kind of self-constructed shield. It's meant to protect you from the fear of your real self, the imperfect, flawed self being rejected. The perfect image hides the vulnerability. But maintaining that shield, that perfect digital artifact, it takes constant stressful work. That worry about what other people think about public perception, it just becomes this background hum in your life.
And the comparison trap just makes it all worse.
Yeah.
You're only seeing everyone else's highlight reels, which gives you this totally warped idea of what normal life is like.
Exactly. You end up measuring your own, unedited, complicated, sometimes difficult life against these polished illusions everyone else is posting. This social comparison theory directly feeds feelings of inadequacy, anxiety, depression. Our sources actually bring up the work of Kenneth Gregan, who saw this coming way back in 1991. He called it multiphrenia.
Multiphrenia. Tell us more about that concept. It really captures that fragmented feeling of modern identity.
Durgan described multiphrenia as this state of fragmentation. The self gets saturated by technology, pulled in all these different directions by competing demands online and offline. Think about it. Historically, maybe you had a few main social roles: family, community, work. Now, through all these different platforms, we're performing dozens of little roles for different audiences that overlap and sometimes want contradictory things from us. The self becomes like having, 20 browser tabs open at once, all demanding attention, all needing validation in different ways. You lose that sense of a single, integrated core self.
Which makes the anxiety almost unavoidable. And here's the key takeaway for our listeners, right? The habits we develop, seeking validation, fearing real vulnerability, constantly worrying about how we look, all those anxieties we practice while curating our social self. They transfer perfectly to curating a spiritual self.
Absolutely perfectly. The spiritual performance just becomes another layer, perhaps the deepest layer, of managing that identity. If I'm already trained to perform for human approval, well, adding God's approval, or at least the appearance of God's approval, to the checklist, it's a small, almost logical step within that whole curated self ecosystem.
What's really striking here is that, okay, the technology is new, the platforms are new, but the core problem, it's ancient. Let's define performance piety as it existed long before, smartphones and Instagram.
Historically, yeah, performance piety is basically doing religious things, praying, giving money, fasting, whatever, but doing them mainly to gain approval for the one doing them. The motivation isn't sincere devotion. It's not about a genuine relationship with God. The motivation gets flipped. The person uses religious acts like tools to build up their own image, feel superior to others, and crucially, to get praise from a human audience.
And the sources keep coming back to the Pharisees in the Bible as a classic example of this, especially how Jesus criticized them.
That's the go-to case study, absolutely. Jesus' critiques, especially in Matthew 6, they really hammer away at the public display aspect. He pointed to those who love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at the street corners, that they may be seen by others. The performance itself was the point, and the reward. The applause they got from the crowd, that used up the value of the act right then and there.
Right, and the implication was, if human applause is your reward, that's all you get. You don't get any further reward from God. But it wasn't just about being public, was it? It was also about this kind of corrosive, self-righteous motive behind it.
Exactly. The classic illustration is that parable, the Pharisee and the tax collector. The Pharisee isn't really praying to God. He's kind of praying at himself, congratulating himself. His whole prayer is about self-exaltation, and he achieves it through comparing himself favorably to others. God, I thank you. I'm not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. Performance piety needs that contrast. It needs someone else to look down on to make the performer look good.
So the focus inevitably lands on the external stuff, the things you can see, the things you can measure.
It's totally preoccupied with the visible signs. That's the whole point behind the critique of cleaning the outside of the cup while the inside is still dirty. Performance piety loves things like special clothing, loud public prayers, traumatic fasting, because those are the things other people can easily see and judge. The inner life, where real spiritual change happens, that's basically irrelevant to the performance itself.
Okay, so if that's the problem, what's the alternative? What's the theological antidote to just performing faith for show?
The antidote presented is radical privacy. Jesus' instruction was, when you give, when you pray, when you fast, do it secretly. Go into your room, close the door, pray where only God sees you, because your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Cool. This totally reorients the whole practice. The only audience that matters is God, and the reward isn't instant social points, it's actual spiritual intimacy and growth.
It also seems to demand that we think about piety differently, not as these isolated broadcastable moments, but as a whole way of life.
That's a critical distinction the sources highlight. Authentic piety isn't just about performing specific religious acts. It's about holistic, integrated, godly living. The Puritans, for instance, they really pushed back against the kind of hyper-individualism that drives the curated self today. They stressed that your personal piety wasn't just for your benefit, but for building up the whole community, the church. Real piety serves the group, not just your own image.
Okay, but this raises a tricky point. Isn't a lot of religious practice meant to be public, like corporate worship? How do we draw the line between this toxic performance piety and legitimate public acts of faith?
That's a crucial distinction, absolutely. We have to separate performance piety from legitimate religious performance, which is liturgy or liturgia. That word literally means public work or work of the people. Liturgy is public, it's shared, it's ritualized, yes. But its purpose is communal formation, building up the body, and this is key. Its focus is directed toward God. When Christians sing together or serve the poor together as a church, that's liturgy. It's meant to glorify God and unify the community.
But performance piety takes that public stage, that visibility, and twists the motive.
Precisely. Performance piety grabs the public aspect but corrupts the why. It shifts the main audience away from God and the community and puts it squarely on the individual's self-display, their social standing. The stage is the same, but the script changes from "to God be the glory" to "hey, look at me."
Hmm.
And now, well, the digital age has handed this modern-day Pharisee a global stage with quantifiable applause meters like never before in history.
Okay, let's connect that ancient temptation directly to the modern digital world. You mentioned earlier that these platforms aren't neutral. How does their actual design, their structure, encourage the worst parts of performance piety?
Yeah, we really have to see these platforms as carefully designed incentive systems. And the main way they fuel this convergence is through what the sources call the economy of affirmation. They're built on this principle of intermittent variable rewards, which neuroscience tells us is incredibly addictive.
That's the dopamine hit, right? The unpredictable reward that keeps us checking our phones.
Exactly. There was that former Facebook executive, Chamath Palihapitiya, who talked very critically about this. He said, users are rewarded in these short-term signals, hearts, likes, and thumbs up. This immediate, direct, measurable feedback loop. It's powerful for any content, but it becomes spiritually dangerous when it's applied to expressions of faith. It gives you instant, quantifiable, external validation for what should be internal spiritual acts.
So this is where human approval gets quantified in a really risky way. The metrics for successful content start to bleed over and become the metrics for a successful spiritual life.
And that quantification, it's spiritually toxic. It starts to blur the lines, making us conflate, as one source puts it, fake, brittle popularity, just the number of likes, with actual spiritual truth or value. The user gets caught in this loop, constantly needing external validation to feel okay about their internal spiritual state. The sources argue that the way we measure success digitally very quickly becomes, maybe subconsciously, the way we measure our spiritual maturity.
And beyond that instant feedback, what about the algorithms themselves, the logic that decides what gets seen? How does that tilt things towards performance?
Well, algorithms are generally programmed to maximize two key things: keeping you on the platform longer and getting you to engage, like, comment, share. So naturally, they tend to favor content that is, well, sensational, visually appealing, highly emotional, maybe polarizing, or just really easy to digest quickly. That's the stuff that gets reaction.
Which often runs counter to genuine piety,
Right.
Which tends to be quieter, more humble, maybe more complex.
It's structurally disadvantaged. The platform design creates this kind of slope, as one source calls it, that tilts away from things like nuance, complexity, biblical virtues like patience or humility. If you post a really thoughtful, maybe complex reflection on suffering, or just the quiet faithfulness of everyday life, it often just sinks without a trace in the feed. The algorithm rewards those who strike while the iron's hot with something bold or perfectly curated visually, or something that pushes emotional buttons. The digital architecture itself makes the Pharisees' loud prayer inherently more successful than the tax collector's quiet, humble plea.
Okay, so the Christian social media influencer seems like the perfect storm, the ultimate case study where this all comes together. They're like this new kind of religious authority, right? Not based on, say, seminary training or being ordained,
Yeah.
but on follower counts and this carefully crafted image.
They really are masters of blending that curated self with performance piety. You see it right away in what the sources call the blended brand profiles. The visuals, the bio, it all mixes explicit faith statements with this very aspirational lifestyle content. Faith becomes part of the package deal.
Oh yeah, you see that constantly. bios that read like, Jesus fashion lifestyle, first-time mom, or maybe love God, love people, travel addict, follow for daily inspo. Faith isn't presented as the absolute core, but as a key, attractive ingredient in this desirable personal brand that ultimately drives engagement and followers.
The message becomes faith is the secret sauce to living this beautiful, successful, often very aesthetically pleasing life. And to keep that audience, to sustain the influence, these individuals put in a massive amount of effort doing what sociologists term authenticity labor.
Authenticity labor, that sounds like a contradiction. The work involved in performing genuineness, how does that actually play out?
It's this very deliberate strategic effort to present yourself as totally genuine, relatable, maybe even a bit raw, even when the content is highly planned and produced. This often involves what's called calibrated amateurism, sharing moments that seem unscripted, like a perfectly lit video where they're tearful or a prayer that feels spontaneous but hits all the right notes. The aim is to build trust. A common tactic is performing vulnerability, sharing struggles or insecurities. But it's usually very controlled. Just enough vulnerability to seem relatable and connect with the audience, but never so much that it actually undermines the core brand image of overall success and spiritual strength. It's a very sophisticated, curated way of looking uncurated.
And because the whole platform, the audience, is built around this idealized persona, any ministry or spiritual guidance they offer inevitably gets tied up with their marketability, right?
Yeah.
It becomes commodified.
The line just dissolves. The functional boundary between offering spiritual guidance and running a commercial enterprise basically disappears. The curated, pious self, the image that attracted the followers in the first place, becomes the main asset. That influence is then leveraged to sell books, promote specific products, maybe clothing lines or supplements, get speaking gigs, all alongside the prayer tips and Bible verses. The self is the product being sold.
Wow. And this leads directly to what our sources call aesthetic theology, which is basically this new way of evaluating faith that's emerged in the digital age. It sounds like judging how holy someone is by how beautiful their Instagram feed looks.
That's precisely it. The inherently visual nature of platforms like Instagram creates this mode of spiritual assessment where the truth, the sincerity, maybe even the depth of someone's faith gets judged mainly by how good it looks aesthetically. To succeed online, spiritual content needs to be packaged perfectly, professionally designed, quote, graphics, stunning photos of the perfect family picnic with a Bible verse overlaid in a nice font.
Can you give a concrete example of how that aesthetic theology works in practice?
Sure. Think about the difference between, say, someone quietly confessing a sin to a trusted friend versus a highly stylized, professionally photographed baptism event shared online. Aesthetic theology implies that the glossy, filtered, perfectly captioned photo, the one that looks aspirational, maybe even expensive, carries more weight, suggests greater spiritual significance than, say, the quiet, unseen faithfulness of a long marriage or years of anonymous service in a soup kitchen. The visual medium starts to equate the outward pomp and circumstances of a beautiful feed with genuine, deep holiness.
And that creates this really dangerous feedback loop, doesn't it? Where the less Instagrammable parts of faith, like quiet suffering or long-term sacrifice or wrestling with difficult theology, get pushed aside because they don't perform well online. They don't get the likes.
They get marginalized, exactly. The platform doesn't reward patience or complexity or messiness or humility. It fosters this expectation that if your life looks good, your faith must be good. And if your life looks messy, well, maybe your faith is lacking. It just reinforces that ancient mistake, confusing the pretty exterior with the state of the heart.
Okay, so the sources argue this shift from witnessing in person, in community, to performing faith online isn't just about changing the channel. It's a much deeper transformation, theologically and even anthropologically. Let's start with the historical idea of witness martyria.
Right. Historically, martyria witness was embodied. It happened in real life with real people. It was relational, it was communal, it took place in physical spaces, the home, the marketplace, the local gathering of believers. And its purpose, as the sources outline it, was kind of threefold: building faith toward God up, strengthening the community in, and inviting others outside the community out. And crucially, the whole point of the witness was to point away from the person witnessing and towards the power of the gospel message itself.
Now contrast that embodied relational witness with how digital performance typically works.
It's dramatically different in several key ways. First, it's often disembodied, right? The screen acts like a veil, separating the real person from the image they project. Second, it's highly individualistic. The main act is creating content, often done alone, detached from communal worship or any real accountability. And third, it tends to be decontextualized and monological. A post is like a broadcast, a single piece of content dropped into the void, stripped from the kind of ongoing back and forth relationship that defines genuine community.
Okay, let's break down this shift using the specific comparison points our sources highlight. What's the big change in the audience?
Historically, the main audience was God, first and foremost, and then the immediate embodied community,
Yeah.
people who actually knew you, saw your flaws, people who could challenge you. Now, the audience is largely this disembodied, quantifiable mass of online followers. They're fundamentally strangers, and their number is the measure of success.
And the core motivation,
Yeah.
it shifts just as drastically. It moves away from glorifying God or building up the community.
And moves towards self-presentation, towards gaining social capital likes, shares, influence, towards building that personal brand. The act of sharing faith becomes less about proclaiming truth and more about crafting and maintaining a desirable online persona.
The way we measure the fruit changes too. Instead of looking for life transformation or acts of service or love, we're counting engagement metrics.
Exactly. Success is measured by likes, shares, follower growth, comment velocity. These external, easily countable metrics replace the harder-to-measure inward signs of spiritual growth and maturity. The system basically trains us to value the metrics over the actual maturity.
But the sources argue the most critical shift, the one that should really concern us theologically, is the change in the theological locus, where the witness is rooted. Historically, it was rooted in the objective truth of the gospel message, the kerygma, and the life of the community, the koinonia. Where is digital performance rooted?
Digital performance is rooted almost entirely in the subjective experience and the curated persona of the individual sharing. That's the fundamental inversion. The self becomes the main text to be read and admired. The power of the testimony seems to come not from the objective truth claims of the gospel, but from how compelling the individual's personal story and curated life appear. Faith gets reframed as just the most attractive feature of their personal narrative.
And if the self is the main text, then inevitably people start admiring the messenger more than the message itself. That sounds like a recipe for spiritual misdirection.
It really is, because it shifts where you get your validation from. If I admire the message, the truth of the gospel itself affirms me. But if I admire the messenger's beautifully curated life, then my validation comes from their performance, from the applause they receive. The focus shifts from God's power to the performer's skill.
Okay, so living this way, constantly curating this perfect image of faith online, while juggling real-world struggles, it must look a huge toll, spiritually and psychologically. What specific consequences do our sources point to?
Psychologically, the big issue is a really fragile sense of identity. When your feeling of self-worth gets tangled up with social media platforms and how well you perform on them, your identity becomes incredibly dependent on the whims of online affirmation. When the likes dip or someone posts a critical comment, your whole sense of self can feel destabilized. It leads directly to more anxiety, more depression. You basically become a slave to your notifications.
And this creates that performance trap. The habits you learn online start infecting your actual religious life offline too.
It creates this really debilitating cycle. Things like discipleship, worship, serving others, they stop being genuine expressions of faith and start feeling like activities you have to perform, activities you're constantly grading yourself on internally. And this fosters a really distorted understanding of the gospel. Intellectually, sure, you might believe in grace, salvation is a free gift. But functionally, you live as if your acceptance by God, and maybe even by your community, depends entirely on how well you perform, on your measurable good works.
That internal conflict must be absolutely exhausting.
It generates deep spiritual struggle. The sources actually link this kind of chronic religious struggle, the constant fear, the guilt, the anxiety about judgment, or being found out, with measurably poorer psychological well-being, lowered life satisfaction. You're trapped in this loop of needing to perform to feel worthy, but never feeling truly worthy because the performance is always based on your own effort.
Let's shift to the purely spiritual costs. Our sources talk about how this phone-based life is just fundamentally at odds with traditional spiritual disciplines that need quiet and focus.
It's not just at odds, it actively dismantles them. A life dictated by algorithm, feeds, and constant notifications systematically replaces stillness, silence, and deep focus with nonstop mental noise and visual input. I mean, the average person struggles to sit quietly for even 10 minutes without reaching for their phone. And that inability to just be still replaces embodied spiritual practices, things like focused prayer, meditation, solitude, with scrolling through a screen. This severely limits the crucial inner work of faith: introspection, honest confession, real moral development.
So if all your spiritual energy is going into managing the external image, what's left for the internal life?
Often, very little. It leads straight to profound spiritual burnout. And this isn't just tiredness from being busy, it's a deeper exhaustion, being energetically broken, as one source puts it, by the constant need for artificial stimulation and validation. And this polished facade, this carefully constructed image of spiritual strength, creates a huge spiritual contradiction. It actively prevents the very vulnerability, the honest confession of weakness that the Bible says is the prerequisite for receiving God's power.
That's the core clash right there. The logic of the curated self is hide weakness, project strength. But the biblical logic is the exact opposite. God's power is made perfect in weakness.
The performing believer is constantly running away from the very conditioned weakness that the gospel promises God will meet and use. They're chasing human approval, which demands they look strong, instead of admitting their need and actually receiving God's grace and strength.
And this whole cycle leads to what our sources call the ultimate theological catastrophe, the transformation of grace into a system of merit, the quiet erosion of the idea of unmerited grace.
Yeah, think about it. Social media runs on transactions. You post content, work, you get rewarded, likes, engagement. When faith is expressed primarily in that environment, it inevitably starts to reshape how you think about salvation itself. The gospel of free grace gets subtly twisted into a transactional system based on merit. You feel like you always have to do more, post better content, look holier to earn or maintain your sense of acceptance.
You start to subconsciously view God as a kind of divine algorithm that needs to be pleased.
Exactly. God gets recast as this cosmic scorekeeper who only hands out blessings or approval in response to impressive spiritual performances that get noticed by others. This fundamentally contradicts the core Christian claim that salvation is a gift, not by works, so that no one can boast. The ultimate price paid is the silent death of unmerited grace in the believer's heart. It gets replaced by this suffocating, self-imposed burden of trying to earn what can only be freely received.
Okay, it's pretty clear the systems themselves push towards performance. But look, digital platforms aren't going away. They're part of life now. So the challenge isn't just to reject them, but maybe to figure out a way of being a disciple that's strong enough to resist that pressure.
Yeah.
What's the main theological antidote the sources suggest?
The core antidote is cultivating genuine, embodied vulnerability. In a culture that's obsessed with relentless curation and perfection, choosing vulnerability is a radical act. It's almost prophetic. And theologically speaking, vulnerability is that confession of self-poverty before God. It's the humble posture you have to take to even be able to receive grace, which, as we just discussed, is the exact opposite of the performance trap.
Right. But we also talked about how vulnerability itself can be performed, like that authenticity labor you mentioned,
Yeah.
just to get attention or pity.
Yeah.
So how do we tell the difference? How do we know it's real vulnerability that helps us grow, not just curated vulnerability to boost the brand?
The context is everything here. True vulnerability, the kind that heals and restores, it almost always thrives in small, trusted, accountable relationships. Face-to-face, with a mentor, a partner, maybe a close small group. It's generally not something you perform for a huge, unknown online audience. The goal of true vulnerability isn't to get likes or sympathy. It's usually aimed at glorifying God by being honest about how his strength shows up best in our human weakness. Curated vulnerability wants applause. Genuine vulnerability seeks restoration and connection.
Okay, so practically speaking, what can believers actually do? What strategies can help make sure our digital habits support our faith instead of undermining it?
Well, first, we need much better training in media literacy and discernment. Believers need help understanding how these platforms are designed to shape our behavior, our emotions, our desires. We need to get better at asking ourselves tough, honest questions before we hit post or share. Why am I really sharing this? Is it actually helpful or just trying to make people react? Am I trying to genuinely communicate something, or am I just bragging, maybe humble bragging, about my spiritual life? Just understanding the architecture is the first step towards resisting the trap.
And the local physical community has to be the absolute anchor in all of this.
Absolutely non-negotiable. The embodied local church community has to be the primary place for spiritual growth, for accountability, for real relationship. Digital tools should ideally enhance what the sources call focal practices, things like worshiping together, serving side by side, studying face to face. They should never be allowed to replace those things. Any healthy digital ministry should ultimately be driving people deeper into real-world, embodied, often sacrificial relationships, not creating some kind of self-sufficient virtual faith bubble.
And finally, the sources stress reclaiming those spiritual disciplines that just, by their nature, don't lend themselves to public performance.
Yes, the hidden practices of faith are the direct counter-programming to the curated self. We need to consciously recenter things like private prayer, maybe fasting, solitude, silence. These are disciplines you can't easily photograph or quantify or share for likes. Our sources even mention specific practices like centering prayer, which is explicitly designed to be absent of supplications, performance, or goal-oriented purposes. Practices like that retrain the heart. They teach it to seek connection with God rather than approval from people. They actively help detox the mind from that constant need for external validation.
So the ultimate answer to the performance trap, it seems, is this fundamental shift in how we see ourselves, moving away from an ethic of performance, constantly trying to achieve an identity.
And towards an ethic of reception. That's the goal. Realizing that authentic identity isn't something you build or perform or achieve, it's something you receive as a gift. An identity defined not by how good your online profile looks or how many likes you get, but by God's unilateral declaration, "You are my beloved child." And when you really rest in that, then any faithful digital witness that flows from it will look different. It won't be a stage for self-promotion, but maybe just a humble, sometimes unpolished pointer directing attention away from yourself towards the giver of that identity, the giver of all gifts.
So if the biggest spiritual danger of our digital age is this temptation to mix up the transaction of getting likes with the radical freedom of getting unmerited grace, then here's the question we want to leave you, the listener, with today. What is the one performative habit online or maybe even offline that you might need to sacrifice this week in order to find deeper rest in an identity that truly doesn't need applause? That's something to take away and reflect on from this deep dive.